Live, local, late breaking. Channel 11 News on Fox 53 starts with breaking news.
Good evening, everyone. Breaking news: a verdict in the Jerry Sandusky trial sex abuse case. Jerry Sandusky moments ago arrived at the courthouse to face the jury that will decide if he goes to jail. I'm Darieth Chisholm. Thanks for being with us tonight. Jerry Sandusky is learning his verdict right now. The jury finished 2 long days of deliberations about a half hour ago before reaching a decision tonight. Channel 11's Courtney Brennan joins us live outside of the courthouse. So, Courtney, what's happening now?
Well, Darieth, this is the moment we have all been waiting for. The entire nation is watching. After more than 12 hours of deliberations today and 8.5 hours of deliberations yesterday, we finally have a verdict in the Jerry Sandusky case. Everyone wants to know, what did the jury decide? Did they decide to go with the prosecution, who categorized Jerry Sandusky as a serial predatory pedophile who preyed on children that he came into contact with through his Second Mile charity? Or will the jury decide with Jerry Sandusky's defense attorney, Joe Amendola, who categorized Jerry Sandusky as just a big kid who wanted to help other kids, and that these alleged victims are in a conspiracy together and they are out to get Jerry Sandusky and they are out to get his money? We will find that out shortly. The verdict could actually be read right now in the courtroom. We will not find out what that verdict is until the entire verdict is read and the judge adjourns court for the evening. Now, Sandusky faces 48 counts of child sexual abuse, and 26 of those are felonies. 22 are misdemeanors. If Jerry Sandusky is convicted on only a few of those felonies, he could spend the rest of his life in prison, because many of those felonies carry mandatory prison sentences of 10 to 20 years. And we all know that Sandusky is 68 years old, so he could absolutely spend the rest of his life in prison. The most serious charges Jerry Sandusky faces are involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, unlawful contact with a minor, aggravated indecent assault, and endangering the welfare of a child. As I mentioned, he faces several misdemeanors as well. They include indecent assault and corruption of minors. Let's get to Jerry Sandusky's defense attorney, Joe Amendola. He has been an impressive figure in this case, always talking to the media, even when he shouldn't be. The judge put a gag order on all the attorneys in this case several weeks ago, and sometimes Joe Amendola has decided not to abide by that gag order. Case in point, just a few hours ago, Joe Amendola was summoned to the judge's chambers because Amendola decided to have an impromptu press conference of sorts with several of the reporters in the courtroom. And when he had that press conference, he said several odd and outrageous statements, including if Jerry Sandusky is acquitted, he would have a heart attack. Now, that is not something you would usually hear a defense attorney say before a verdict. Once the judge got word that Amendola said that, he summoned him to his chambers and obviously had a little chat. Let's talk about the prosecution. They also had a development just a few hours ago. The Attorney General herself, Linda Kelly, she arrived just about 30 minutes ago. Her office has been investigating Jerry Sandusky for the last 2.5 years, and tonight is the culmination of all that work. We heard 7 days of testimony presented by the prosecution. They put 8 alleged victims on the stand, and those victims told horrific stories of alleged sexual abuse at the hands of Jerry Sandusky. All of the alleged victims explained a pattern of abuse. They said they met Sandusky through a Second Mile charity, and they started riding in the car with him at first, and Sandusky would put his hand on their knee. And then they would talk about Sandusky taking them to the Penn State training facility for workouts. And then those workouts then would turn into showers in the Penn State locker room. And in those showers, inappropriate touching would occur. And then several of the victims got on the stand and told stories of more graphic sexual abuse that occurred in Jerry Sandusky's basement and in his home and in hotel rooms when Jerry Sandusky would take them to games. The testimony at times, it was gut-wrenching. It pulled at your heartstrings. It was very, very hard to listen to. And so tonight, these alleged victims are anxiously waiting what this verdict will be. Will Jerry Sandusky be found guilty? We will bring you the latest information as it comes in, and definitely check back in with you all throughout this newscast. Darieth, back to you.
All right, thanks so much, Courtney. And of course, we're staying right there to give you the very latest as soon as we understand what that verdict is. In the meantime, security has been tight in the courthouse and all around the courthouse. We found several different law enforcement departments. The chief told us they don't expect any problems if Sandusky is convicted, but they are preparing for the possibility that if Sandusky is acquitted, if he's found not guilty, then there could be problems on campus of Penn State and at Sandusky's home, and also with him personally.
You know, in my own personal thought, that if you know, a verdict, if he doesn't leave in shackles, there might be some upset people. I don't know, you know, just amongst the law enforcement committee, we're ready for any issues in State College or Bellefonte that may arise from this.
Okay, and we'll continue to follow this breaking news out of Centre County and bring you the very latest. That verdict in the Jerry Sandusky trial, waiting for it any minute now. The jury's decision to be announced soon. Stay with us for the very latest. All right, we're continuing to follow our breaking news out of Centre County tonight. The jury in the Jerry Sandusky trial has reached a verdict. It is expected to be announced anytime soon. You, of course, are looking live at shots there just outside of the courtroom. It's also where our Courtney Brennan is standing by live to bring us an update right now. Courtney?
We just want to give you a feel of what is going on. It's absolutely amazing to see. My photographer will show you the front steps of the Centre County Courthouse here in Bellefonte. This is the crowd. These are people here in Centre County, here in Bellefonte, who live nearby, who have been coming to this trial every day for the last 3 weeks. They have been standing in line to try and get one of the 85 passes to be part of history, to go in and sit on this trial. And then this is a look at the media. More than 300 reporters have registered for this trial. We have more than 30 live and satellite trucks broadcasting live feeds of this verdict all over the nation and all over the world, frankly. This is a huge event. I don't have to tell anybody that, and I think you can see by the shots we're showing you now just how important it is and how people have incredible interest in this story. Again, the mass of people on the front steps of the Centre County Courthouse. It looks like we have a verdict. We have a verdict. Renee Kaminsky, let's stay with it. We have a verdict in the Jerry Sandusky case. They were not allowed to read the verdict until the judge adjourned court for the day, and he must have just done that. Again, Jerry's, here it is. Here it is. Here it is. 45?
45 counts guilty.
45 counts?
45 counts, only 2 not guilty.
Okay. Jerry Sandusky was found guilty on 45 counts. 45 counts he was found guilty, only 2 not guilty counts of indecent assault. Renee Kaminsky, who was in the courtroom, says Jerry was stunned. 45 counts, Jerry Sandusky was found guilty on 45 counts. Only 2 counts he was found not guilty on. My colleague Renee Kaminsky, she was in the courtroom and says Jerry Sandusky was absolutely stunned when the verdict was read and that Dottie cried. There were cheers here on the steps of the Centre County Courthouse here in Bellefonte, and we expect to hear very soon from the attorneys for the victims and then also from the Attorney General's office. This is an incredible moment for them. As I mentioned, the Attorney General herself, Linda Kelly, she is here. After 2.5 years of investigating Jerry Sandusky, tonight it culminates in this, a validation of all their hard work. Again, Jerry Sandusky found guilty on 45 counts, not guilty on 2 counts of indecent assault. That is the latest here from Centre County. We will bring you interviews coming up next right from the courthouse steps.
All right, Courtney, thank you. And for those of you all joining us here on Channel 11 News, as we just said, we've learned that there has been obviously a verdict in this case against Jerry Sandusky, guilty on 45 counts, 2 not guilty of the counts that he faced in total. Joined now with Blaine Jones. He is our legal expert. You've been watching this case with us for some time. This came relatively quickly, 2 days of deliberations. We got the word that the jury had reached a verdict probably about a half hour ago, and now these counts, 45 of them found not guilty.
Darieth, it came quickly, however, it is not a shock. I predicted that it would come by Friday. I thought it would come by this weekend. Reason being, the evidence was simply overwhelming against Mr. Sandusky. I thought that the defense, unfortunately, did not come out aggressive. If you have a case and the evidence is overwhelming against your client, you come out like Mike Tyson. You come out swinging, you come out with haymakers. In my opinion, they came out tentative. They threw pity-pat jabs, and as a result, Mr. Sandusky gets knocked out.
Now, with these counts, I mean, of course, many of them very serious, and we obviously know that with those felonies, most of them being felonies, he could face life in prison here.
No, not could. He's going to face life in prison. And if it's a homicide or something like that, Darius, you get life without the possibility of parole. What Mr. Sandusky is going to receive when he is eventually sentenced is life by numbers. In other words, he'll get 30 or 40 years. He's 68 years old. You can do the math.
Yeah, this is a man who's 68 who will likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. Blaine, thank you. Stay with us here. We want to go back out to Center County. Our Renee Kaminsky was in the courtroom when the verdict was read. Let's join her now. Renee.
Okay, I just left the courtroom, and I have to tell you, Dottie was crying the entire time. Jerry looked absolutely stunned as the verdict was read, and it was read by counts. I watched the jury when they came in. They never even looked over at Jerry Sandusky, and as they read the count one by one, and it was very, very solemn in that courtroom, Jerry just stared at the jury and just seemed like he was in absolute shock at the whole thing. I looked over, and there was Dottie and all her family members, everyone that she had come into court with, which included her daughter, and it looked like the family members that she had been in court all week with, including some good friends of hers. They were reaching over and trying to comfort her. The judge said, "Mr. Sandusky, you have been judged guilty by a jury of your peers." He then revoked bond for Jerry Sandusky and remanded him into sheriff's custody. So Jerry Sandusky walked out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his head down, and I have to tell you, he looked really stunned by the jury's verdict. Again, 45 guilty counts. There was not a word in that courtroom because Judge Cleland, he warned everyone, "I will have you arrested if you say anything. I will not tolerate any kind of outburst in my courtroom." So it was really, really fascinating how this all came about and how quickly it was read. We thought we would be in there for about 45 minutes as the judge, the jury foreman read count by count, but he actually went pretty fast, and then the judge, they polled the jury, and the jury actually one by one said guilty, 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 guilty. Only 2 not guilties, and those were the indecent assaults and 1 involuntary deviant sexual intercourse not guilty. But as you heard, I came out the steps, gave Courtney the information to bring to you first, and the whole place was erupting. People were cheering, and lots of applause here on the courthouse steps. But again, you know, everything is very well controlled here, so they don't want anyone to get too out of control with this verdict. Sentencing is coming up in about 90 days for Mr. Sandusky as well. But again, they did revoke his bail, so he's going right to jail straight from here in the custody of sheriff's deputies. I want to bring in Courtney Brennan. Okay, you're okay. Some of the things that I noticed when I went in is the judge said, "Everyone stay seated, remain quiet. There won't be any outburst at all." The jury came in, they did not even look at Jerry Sandusky, and we were all straining, kind of craning our necks to see if they were going to check him out. They didn't. They didn't even look his way. They just sat and kind of stared at their laps or looked over at the judge for further instruction. I was amazed at how quickly the whole thing went. Like I said, we thought we'd been there for about an hour, but it went really, really fast. And Jerry, he didn't look at his wife. I did not see him glance at his wife, but I did have a lot of spectators in front of me. I didn't see him actually look over at Dottie when he left. He kind of just left, sort of like a hangdog expression on his face, and just went out the door, and no one said a word in that courtroom. We'd all been warned not to speak or to any outburst at all, and there was no outburst. I can tell you one of the victims was in the courtroom. He was sitting on the left side of the courtroom, and one of his family members, we think it was a family member, kind of patted him on the back when the verdicts were read one by one by one. Guilty, guilty, guilty. So in the end, 45 criminal counts, guilty. Only 2 not guilties of indecent assault and 1 involuntary deviant sexual intercourse. So these are all mostly felonies. So we're looking at sentencing guidelines, 500 years or more for Mr. Sandusky. Back to you in the studio.
All right, Renee, thank you so much. And so, Blaine, as we continue our discussion here in the studio, my thoughts right now are with families, the victims, as they hear this. I mean, they've got to feel this sense, at least, of relief, of some gratification to know that this process is finished and he's been found guilty.
I agree with you 100%, Darius. The court of public opinion found him guilty months ago. The court of law has now followed suit, and we must all, as United States citizens, respect the decision of the court of law. I'm glad for the victims. Hopefully that they'll feel better about this. The jury of his peers has reached a decision. The decision is guilty. I respect the decision of the jury. Yeah,
and we certainly know that, as you said, the court of public opinion has long since said that this man is guilty. And we, of course, followed this story from the very beginning. And to have it come out right now and to get this verdict and the information now is so very important. You're looking live at a shot just outside of the courtroom when Channel 11's Renee Kaminsky came out with the verdict, and we, of course, announced it. We found and heard, obviously, jeers of people. We heard, the crowd respond, and to hear that sense of, response, as an attorney, Joe Amendola has got to feel like, now what?
It's tough. I've been on both ends, the guilty and the not guilty end, and I tell you, those 6 words, guilty, it's the worst feeling in the world when you're an attorney because you feel like you let your client down. Contrary to popular opinion, Mr. Sandusky was probably not a monster to Mr. Amendola. He got to know him over the course of his representation, and you get a friendship with this person, and you were fighting together. You're in the trenches fighting, and you feel like you let your guy down. There's no worse feeling.
And speaking of, I mean, obviously we got from Renee this sense that when he heard the verdict, he was shocked. Sandusky, as she said, appeared like, what's going on? And right. In fact, he hung his head and walked out in cuffs, reprimanded into custody of the sheriffs. But she said she got this sense that he seemed a little shocked over this.
No matter what the verdict is, in my opinion, I've been doing it for a while, it's surreal. Whether you get a not guilty or a guilty, because you realize at that very moment, those 12 people, that jury of your peers, your fate is in their hands. And that materializes once that foreperson takes that piece of paper and says either guilty or not guilty. And I think it's just a rush. It's either a feeling of complete joy or the complete opposite feeling of complete desperation. And I think that that's what Mr. Sandusky is experiencing right now.
The judge reportedly said, quiet in this courtroom, no outbursts, right. No reactions. These counts will be read one by one. And I would imagine with 48 of them having to come out, of which 45 he was found guilty of, it had to be stirring for everyone in the courtroom.
Well, first of all, that's how it has to be. Every count has to be read. Count 1, guilty. Count 2, guilty. And down the line. But quite frankly, Darius, once you hear the first 10 guilty counts, what difference does it make after that? After that, you're numb to it. But the judge, I like that. The judges I've practiced in front of in Allegheny County, it's the same way. It's no nonsense. This is a court of law. There's a certain decorum in a court of law. You're not supposed to have outbursts. You're not supposed to do anything like that. You respect the decision of the jury.
Let's take some video now. We understand that we have of Jerry Sandusky leaving the courtroom. As you can see there, in handcuffs, being reprimanded into the sheriff's custody. This man, of course, just found guilty on 45 counts in these sex abuse cases that we've followed for some time. He is quickly being, escorted right to the county jail, the prison there in Center County. I hear a number of people perhaps asking questions or responding, but he is now a man who is facing some serious jail time as a matter of this. We understand that sentencing will come in about 90 days.
That is correct.
So we don't know how long, but it's likely with all of these counts that it's going to be some time.
Well, there's a reason behind that. The reason is that generally speaking, when your client has no record whatsoever, Mr. Sandusky is considered a 0 prior record score. We go by what's called the sentencing guidelines in Pennsylvania. Therefore, you get what's called a pre-sentencing report. The pre-sentence report is basically who is Mr. Sandusky academically, who is his what is his background. That report will come back to the judge, and the judge will make a decision based off of that report as to what he should be sentenced to.
We'll talk more about his sentencing in a moment, but let's get back out live now to Courtney Brennan, who's just outside the courthouse with more. Courtney.
Good evening, Darius. I'm joined by Wes Oliver. He's been our legal expert, our legal analyst up here, helping us sort through all the different things in this trial. And Wes, 45 counts guilty, 3 counts not guilty. Your take?
Well, we weren't terribly surprised by this result. You could see in the jury's questionings when they came back, they wanted to know two things. They wanted to hear Mike McQueary's testimony read back to them. Mike McQueary wasn't entirely sure what he saw. They came back with a not guilty count in the most serious of allegations from the Mike McQueary testimony. Mike McQueary didn't actually say he saw the facts necessary for the most serious counts against the victim or involved in the victim for which he offered the testimony. So they had McQueary's testimony read back. After they did, they went back and deliberated, and then they called for the testimony from victim 8. Victim 8 was the other victim whom we were not able to identify, who was observed by a janitor when Sandusky was allegedly performing sex acts on him. But he described specific sex acts that he witnessed. So
his was stronger testimony, you felt?
In a way, well, actually, his testimony provided specific details that Mike McQueary could not provide. McQueary saw both of these men from the back, and Sandusky was substantially taller than the young boy whom he was standing behind.
Well, let's talk about if we think that Jerry Sandusky is surprised at all, if Joe Amendola is surprised at all, because you and I were both in the courtroom, and then we spoke after, and I know we reported it several times. Joe Amendola gave one heck of a closing argument for Jerry Sandusky, and after that closing argument, there were many people in that courtroom who wondered, did he plant those seeds of doubt? Do you think Amendola and Sandusky are surprised?
Well, we know Amendola's not surprised because he was telling reporters during the break that he would have a heart attack if Jerry was acquitted on all the counts. So I don't think he's shocked. But I think that Amendola did such a remarkable job with the closing arguments, we might have expected a few more not guilties than we got. There was a real mismatch during the course of the evidence. The prosecution won every single round leading up to the closing arguments. When we got to the closing arguments, the defense ran circles around the prosecution. I really think the prosecution was taken aback by how strong the defense argument was.
Even though that defense argument came across incredibly strong, they still didn't win.
No.
Prosecution 45 guilty counts.
Oh, this is a big win for the prosecution. And in terms of the amount of jail time Jerry Sandusky will get out of this, those 3 not guilty verdicts, 1 in a felony, but the other 2 in misdemeanors, are virtually meaningless for the amount of time Jerry Sandusky will spend in jail.
Now, you and I have talked briefly about jail time and sentencing for Jerry Sandusky, because even if he was found guilty on just a few felonies, he likely would spend the rest of his life in jail. But we were talking, you were saying there was a certain wrinkle in terms of sentencing because the judge does have some discretion. Talk to me about that.
The judge has extraordinary discretion because the judge has complete control over whether these sentences are served concurrently or consecutively, meaning at the same time or back to back.
Okay.
The judge can decide that all these sentences should run consecutively, which would put Jerry Sandusky perhaps up into 300-400 years worth of jail time.
Wow.
The judge could also find they should all run concurrently, which means that, and it could potentially give him the mandatory minimum on the most serious offenses, which would mean 10 years. So the judge now has a range between 10 and well over 300 years in his hands.
Okay. And we all know that Jerry Sandusky just left the courthouse in handcuffs.
Right.
He was taken to the Center County Jail to be processed and to await his sentencing. Will we see, like we see in so many other trials, during sentencing we see victim impact statements.
Right.
We see the victims come in, sit down, explain to the judge how their life has been ruined by that individual person about the offense. Will we see that here? Will we see those victims again?
I think we probably will. We will definitely see the prosecution put on a very strong case about the impact of Sandusky's reign of terror against these kids when it comes time for sentencing, because and they have to do that because the judge has extraordinary sentencing authority here. This is not a situation where we're talking about a strict set of sentencing guidelines which call for an automatic sentence. So given the judge's extraordinary discretion, the prosecution is going to want to put on a very strong case as to why the judge should exercise his discretion toward the upper end of the range that's now available to him.
Okay. And what Wes was explaining, I think my mic was down for a little bit, but what we have it back. What Wes was explaining, I asked him about okay, I'm going to take your mic for a second. Wes was explaining, will the alleged victims come back to court and talk to the judge before the judge decides what their sentence will be? And I'm going to hand the mic back to you in a second. How quickly will the sentencing happen?
Well, we know that the sentencing is going to be in 90 days. That'll give the probation office a chance to prepare a pre-sentence report that will detail the nature of the crime, Sandusky's psychological condition, and will make a recommendation to the judge. The judge is free to reject or accept this. It's really all in the judge's hands now, although probation officers who prepare these reports have a great deal of influence over the judges. This is a unique case, however, because of the profile of the case. Another thing that makes this case unique is the age of the defendant. He is 68 years old. There is no way that any reasonable sentence for all these crimes could amount to anything less than life in prison. So the judge could effectively give Jerry Sandusky a penalty of 600 years, 300 years, whatever.
Just to make a statement.
Just to make a statement without changing what will happen to Jerry Sandusky. He will, in all likelihood, spend the rest of his natural life behind bars.
And let's talk about what a win this is, not just for the prosecution, but for these alleged victims. You saw those young men, I saw those young men. It took an incredible amount of courage to come up and sit in front of that entire courtroom and publicly state who they were and what they went through, and you could see it in their faces how difficult it was for them, but it was necessary. And advocates for victims of sexual abuse says it was incredibly necessary for them to come forward so that other people, if they are in that same circumstance, can come forward. What a win for these alleged victims, am I right? For these victims, I guess.
Well, it's always satisfying for someone when a jury comes back and vindicates your side of the story. And so, I mean, I don't think this is a win, though, for anybody tonight.
True.
I think that the prosecution should walk away from this very sad because this has happened. All we've done is discover a very wrong act and are now trying to make amends to the extent the criminal justice system can. I mean, we're talking about incarcerating a man now for the rest of his natural life. No matter what he's done, we should do that with a heavy heart, regardless of how we got there or why we're doing it. I looked behind me and I see the celebration. And as a criminal law professor and criminal lawyer myself, it breaks my heart that people take happiness out of this result. Regardless of what this result was, this is a sad night, and I don't like the fact that there's a celebratory atmosphere behind us.
Well, I think, and when I said a win for the victims, I think it was incredibly hard for them to come forward and tell their story, and I'm sure they feel some sense of relief and some sort of vindication this evening. Thank you.
Sure.
I'm going to send it back to the studio. This was Wes Oliver. Thank you so much. We always appreciate your insight and your expert legal advice. We are live in Center County. The Jerry Sandusky verdict just came down. 45 counts guilty, 3 counts not guilty. We will have continued live coverage when we come back to you in the studio.
All right, thank you. And we want to take you to reaction just after the verdict was read of the crowd outside, as Courtney was just discussing. Let's take a listen. Of course, the crowd just out of the Center County courtroom learning the verdict that Jerry Sandusky had been found guilty on 45 of the 48 sex abuse counts that he faced. Blaine, this, of course, being a very reactionary night this evening. Most people, as we've been obviously listening and seeing that video in a celebratory sense, it's interesting that our legal expert there in the field said that this is not a night to celebrate. I mean, there are obviously countless victims out there, families who've been impacted by this, and now a man who goes to jail as a result of the seriousness of this crime.
No, I don't agree with that opinion. Those victims, they got their day in court and they won. They can celebrate because they feel like that weight has been lifted off of them. The people outside, the court of public opinion, they feel like the court of law vindicated those young men as well. It's how it goes. This is a tough business. This is a win or lose business. You get in there and you fight. Like I said, you throw Mike Tyson punches, not pity-pat jabs. Jerry Sandusky's legal team did not do that. Jerry Sandusky unfortunately got knocked out tonight, and he's going to spend the rest of his life in jail. This
case so far-reaching, so impactful, not just for the victims and their families, but for people across this country who have certainly faced, sex abuse and crimes of this such that, obviously tonight they're viewing this and, as you say, have this sense of celebratory. Let's turn things back now to Courtney Brennan, who has a juror with her now. Courtney?
Good evening, Darius. Yes, this was a potential juror, Kristen Krunick. She was one of the first 200 brought here to the Center County Courthouse. She could have been picked to sit on this trial. Good evening. Can you tell me, sort of, describe the mood, describe the feeling for people here in Bellefonte in Center County on this night of this most monumental verdict?
I think the overwhelming feeling that everyone has here is a sense of relief, a sense that justice has been done, and if you can call it happiness, I guess we would call it that. I think everyone feels that justice has been served to Mr. Sandusky for what he's done.